Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Joel Ginn, a social and environmental psychologist, about techniques called defaults and how they can be a pretty simple, low-tech lever to get a big result in behavior change across large groups of people. We'll be diving into his recently published research paper titled, "Can You Default to Vegan? Plant-Based Defaults to Change Dining Practices." Joel is a postdoctoral research fellow at Boston College, a visiting assistant professor at Grinnell College, and he is part of the Social Influence and Social Change Lab. That sounds pretty fun, where he focuses on climate and reducing meat consumption. Now, if you haven't heard about defaults before, they are a particular psychological technique where you change the nature of what people are choosing. A popular example of where this gets used to explain defaults is the form you fill out on your driver's license about organ donation. Is the default that you're just automatically an organ donor and you have to tick the box to say, no, I don't want to be an organ donor? Or does the form come as the default where you're not an organ donor and then you have to check the box? These defaults that are built into our world highly dictate the choices that we make, because it's just easier to go with what is put out there in front of us than kind of have to think about it and put some effort into it and make a change. And if there is one thing that is put in front of us as a default over and over again, it is our food choices, and in specifically having meat at the center of those food choices. What I love about these conversations is that they always emerge a practical thing that you can do in your sustainability world, as well as a deeper insight or idea that you're not going to find just by reading the research paper alone. In this case, what Joel talks about towards what we get into towards the end of the episode is how easy it is for us to get stuck in these kind of in-groups or these preaching to the converted green groups. And we kind of want to get out to people that are different to us, but then we kind of also want the support of people that are close to us. And that to get a really clear idea about having two different sorts of campaigns or groups in your own personal advocacy work, and to not try to mix them up. And what I mean by that is that you create one group that is just to support you. This is for your deep green inner circle. So this is not meant to be preaching to the converted, because you're not preaching. You get all of your deep green buddies together to support each other, to come up with new ideas about how to reach out to your community. And you are not trying to bring new kind of non-green people into this. This is not an outreach group. This is a support group. And then you have a different program or campaign or group that is specifically about bringing new people in, which is all about outreach, which is all about bringing beginners in. This type of like split group or split campaign, which I think is just a major insight, a super important thing to do, and a really powerful and intelligent way to use your advocacy for both support in one type of realm and then outreach in another. Whether you are a single person as an activist, or you are a major city or large not-for-profit campaign trying to get out across thousands or even millions of people, I think this bit of advice is just gold, and you got to do it. This podcast was recorded or was hosted inside the School of Climate Action Design community. And it was particularly well-timed because in week 4, we go into choice architecture, and defaults and these choices we put in front of us are core to this concept of choice architecture. If you join as a member of the School of Climate Action Design, you can attend these podcast sessions live, get to know the guest, ask questions, and then follow up with the guest afterwards. All of our expert guests are also members of the school. They have accounts. You can DM them. You can follow up and be a part of this amazing, vibrant community we have about people that are passionate about the science and the art of designing actions. Now let's jump into our conversation with Dr. Joel Ginn. Welcome to the show, Dr. Joel.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to dive into this topic today called defaults, which, as many social psychology and behavior change techniques, people haven't heard of this word before, really know what it means. Can you explain what a default is?
I would love to. So Defaults or choice defaults are a technique within the family, techniques known as choice architecture. Basically, when we go out throughout our daily lives and we're given options to choose from, they're often not simply laid out as a list of equal options. You can change how these options are displayed, and that can change how people make their decisions. The cleanest example that is what we use in our research here is menus. When you go to a restaurant, options are not laid out in a alphabetical list or a random list. They are grouped and classified by appetizers, entrees, things like that, often with vegetarian options listed in their own separate section. By listing options in a specific order and labeled in a specific way, options are made an explicit or implicit default, one that you're expected to make. And that can help people make these decisions, guide their decision making processes, but it can also lead people towards what are often unsustainable choices or towards options that support the status quo. Another example might be when you're asked to switch over from traditional electric sources to more green sources from your electricity provider. They'll often use an opt in or opt out type of schematic. Whatever, if it, in an opt out type of schematic, they will give you the default choice and you have to make a purposeful effort to go for the non defaulted option. Now, by simply changing in that situation what the two options are, which one is the default one they have to opt out of or opt into the non-defaulted option, people more often will go with what they think the default option is. That is the one that is presented as the default one. Now, this isn't just how options are laid out, they can have pretty important psychological consequences, conveying things like institutional norms, norms about what other people are doing, and the perceived effort or what is correct to do in any given situation.
So when you're talking about a default, like through the lens of, we're sort of talking through the lens of people who are practically designing this stuff. Like we're literally the ones who are making the forms, who
Mhm.
are building the websites. Like what might that look like in the physical world if I was a graphic designer actually making something?
This can look a lot of different ways, which is one of the things that's really exciting about this line of research is the way you can signal a default can look any number of ways. One thing you can think about is graphic design and how you are portraying these options. Again, I'm going to use menu design as an example. If you're hosting an event and you show we're having hamburgers as a way to bring people into the event, and you have big bright pictures of the hamburger and you're saying a lot of things like juicy, delicious to describe toppings, give a lot of emphasis and description to that option, that signals to people that that is the default option. And then below that in tiny font, you have there will also be vegetarian kebabs. Like this is not presenting these as equal options. So the order in which you present things, the amount of space and emphasis that you give, that can really signal a default in some way. Similarly, if you have a type of drop down option or something that is you're expected to get the default option unless you say otherwise. Another example might be if you are listing gender in a demographics form and you say male, female as two buttons that you can click, and then just have an other option that is a fill in the blank. It is explicitly signaling that anything that is not male or female is not the default option now. That's not a great example for behavior change because we're not trying to get people to change those things, but does signal something about society in the same way.
Yeah, but what you're bringing up though is it's not just like a default as in a sort of a short, not a short circuit, but just a simple sort of like a short, easy habit. It's both the easiest thing to do, but it's also signaling what is expected of you or what is normal. And we're
Mhm.
very, very, or humans, we tend to deeply want to go with what is normal or what is expected of us and something that's like not going to make us stand out and be the weird, uncomfortable one in the group. So if you like with the hamburger example, the hamburger is like, if it's a really big picture, is the normal thing that everybody is doing. And if you get the tiny little star down the bottom and get the plant-based option, you're the weird one who's not going with the group. So it's got this big like social signifier in addition to the kind of what you call it, what a heuristic, like a short, super easy habit. You've got these two dimensions going on.
Exactly. There are a lot of things going on under the hood where people are thinking about when they're making decisions or interpreting what these setups are conveying. As I said, it's norms about what everyone else is doing, the difficulty of going for the non-default option, and these heuristics of what's expected of you. Another example might be travel when you're talking with a group of friends about how you're going to get from A to B for a group vacation. There rarely is going to be a conversation about how do we get from A to B. It more often just immediately goes into, okay, I'm taking this flight and I'm taking this flight and coordinating that without a discussion even of the non-default options of, well, what if we road trip? Well, what if we take trains? Things like that.
Yeah, I just wrote down that third option also with the defaults, which is like, how hard is it to not do the defaults? Like, it
Mhm.
could be just checking a box or choosing the default. It can actually be pretty hard. And often in society, doing the non default is actually really hard. Like in some states, to get solar on, they make it really hard for you because the electricity utilities don't want you to get solar. In California, they try to make it easier, but the default is to not have solar. So there are just, even if you want to get solar, it's like, oh, you have to, there's these forms and there's these like feed-in tariffs and permits. There's like so many like barriers to, not necessarily even big financial barriers, if you take that out, just kind of confusing bureaucratic barriers of just more stuff to do. So
But
that's like a, just this other dimension of the default is like, how hard is your like non-default to do?
And even going through those processes, there's this effort of understanding and knowledge and seeming how difficult it is or what you have to know. If you're defaulted into coal-powered electricity, you don't have to know how that's generated. You don't have to know what it takes of you. But if you want to make what is even a relatively easy shift, like here in Boston, we'll get flyers that say you can shift to renewable energy as your electricity provider. You just need to opt into this program. Many people might get that flyer and they have to then think about going and doing the research. Will this cost me more? And even taking that first step of thinking about, well, what do I need to do from this? It's been made a very easy step of just opt in, but people feel like they need to research and take and figure out what those next steps are. There's a lot of both effort in terms of taking those steps in some cases, but even when it's easy, people will cognitively put some effort into the non-default option where they don't put that same effort into the default option.
I only recently, about a year ago, came across this phrase called choice architecture from another one of my guests on the show, and I've totally latched onto it. And now I have a module in the climate action design school. It's just called choice architecture. Mainly, what I do is sort of UI, UX design, landing pages. I'm really sort of like a practical designer of
Mhm.
campaigns. I realize this is just so much of the design of change. Like, it's a really massive part of like when you're trying to get people to do green stuff, this choice architecture is just like it's fundamental to it. And there's
Yeah,
this problem with the other guest we had on. His name is Dr. Ruben Klein. He was testing like if you give people like these huge amounts of green choices, like 100 things to do, 25 things to do to go green, like do they work better than just giving people like 5 things to do? And inevitably they don't work better. Like you give people too many choices and they just sort of they're less effective. But can you talk a bit more about, you mentioned it earlier, but just a bit more about like in really baby steps, like what is choice architecture and what are the biggest things? Like if you've just heard this word for the first time and you're like working on your 523 tips to go green, which is a very common thing for us in the green space to do, like what are the kind of like rubrics or columns of trying to get this right and things we want to do and also mistakes we want to avoid?
I'll say upfront, I'm a social psychologist by training, and this delves into things like behavioral economics, where I'm getting my feet wet with these types of projects here, but by no means do I have the full scope of choice architecture and what all ways that can look like. But I would say it's a good step to consider simply how you're phrasing your questions when you're asking people to take some type of behavior or some type of action, and how just setting up the question or setting up the behavior change itself can make that an easier change or not, and whether it makes an easier change psychologically or not. There are things we've talked about here, like norm perceptions, and those will be affected by these as well. But on its basic level, it's simply how do we change the way the choice is made and how does that impact decision making? As you said, when you have 100, 200 choices, people enter choice paralysis and might, choose not to do any number of things or might rely on heuristics that might not guide their behavior in the most effective or most sustainable way. When you're looking down at a singular choice, if we're trying to get people to do one specific thing, changing the decision making framework in a way that supports that can be a really key, small, unobtrusive step that doesn't require individual interactions. You don't have to go and educate people. You don't have to try to convince them of anything. You just need to change the structure, and that inherently will change not everyone, but will change many people's behavior to some extent.
Because you mentioned it in the study, you've got this conscious versus unconscious processes going on. Sometimes it's called system 1 and system 2 decision making, and these automatic versus these habitual systems. It's sort of a common thing. You would have come across it in the green space. It was like, oh, like, why do you have to look at like individual behavior changes? We can't change things with just like habits and green nudges. Like, it's not enough when we really need like systems change. And somehow that these immediate habits and these unconscious systems are somehow less valid when what you need is sort of big kind of like top down systems interventions. But yet, when you can use these, see it a bit more scientifically, like see these certain amount of behaviors that really sit under the bracket of these immediate habits, like menu defaults or like just these immediate choices that you're not even thinking about, this system 1 in the mind, you can actually sort of pull a lever to have like a really big result that's sort of easier, but perhaps going down a long multi-decade sort of education path like is a much like harder thing to do. So can you explain a little bit more about sort of the importance of getting into these like non sort of complex decision making and the benefit of really or the power of where we really do want to focus on these immediate habit interventions? Sorry, this is a very long, rambly way to ask you a question, but why does focusing on these immediate sort of unconscious processes is still really important in the context of bigger movements of social change and ultimately leading to big systems change? And sorry for taking like 1,000 words to ask the question.
No, it's a good question, and it gets at a lot of dynamics of things that we're getting into in, this type of research. We're looking at behavior change in one domain using one type of intervention, but it's something that we in our lab have been grappling with and studying. Like we have some work that will be coming out soon about the like individual systemic change and what people in America really think we need. I think the discussion around individual systemic change and what the role of this type of intervention plays in there is that it's not one or the other. In this work, we weren't collecting data from individuals. We weren't looking at the underlying psychological processes. That's been done in some other work. Here, we were looking at the real world effect, tracking sales data from using this intervention in three distinct locations to show that, yes, this can have a measurable impact, and measuring what that impact can be. In the discussion of individual and systemic change, this sits in an interesting space because we are inherently acting upon individuals. Like we're changing the system, we're changing the structure. So you could argue that this is a systemic intervention and it's changing behavior that way, but it's doing so by changing individuals' behavior. This is not getting people to go and vote for policy change. This is not getting people to try to change the economic systems we live in and try to get companies to change their behavior. But it shows this area where there might be a space for them to have some interplay between them. Because if people, like in the environmental space, push for companies to then make these types of green shifts that utilize these choice defaults, that can enter a feedback loop where that then gets people to engage in more green, more sustainable behavior and take what are these new defaulted options, which then can feed back to other companies that they should be doing this as well. And that can then ripple up and down the chain as well, going to changing consumption habits and how that can change industry perceptions of what actually is needed, what's actually in demand. At the same time, there's an open question here of whether this systemic intervention has meaningful impact outside of the defaulted space. So we tracked and showed that there was a change in the dining halls where we ran this intervention. So it shows that the systemic change intervention worked. But we don't have data about what people did when they went out for dinner elsewhere, when they went home during the summer, or any number of things, or what they did after they left these universities. So these default interventions can work, but without that individual level intervention and tracking individuals, we don't know if this intervention actually changes behavior going forward. I think there's reason to suspect that at least opens the door and gets people to try these options, which can be a big step in getting people towards a more plant-based future. But there's still open work to be done in that area. And I think that's especially an area that I'm interested in continuing this work to look at where this type of systemic intervention can work in tandem with some of these more traditional individual level psychological interventions where we both use a default and explicitly tell people most people are picking this option to signal a norm.
And can you explain two different options that you tested? You've got a great photo on it. And I just want to say good job for putting a photo in the research paper, because I read a lot of these research papers and finding out the visual of what people were testing. So as a designer, like I actually really need to see that to see like how it
Mhm.
worked. Often they're not there. And it's like some one little line of text. And I want to know like what did it look like on the screen or on the picture on the wall? Like I need to see it to figure out how to sort of draw from it. So good job on doing that. Please keep doing it and encourage everyone else in the academic community to keep doing it. But yeah, so you tested two different meal layouts side by side. What were they? And tell me the results
Yes.
also. What happened?
Absolutely. So this was an intervention done at three different institutions over several weeks of the fall semester. The actual timing changed institution to institution, but they were all in these dining halls that were all you care to eat. So people came in, they went to any number of different stations within that dining hall, took any number of dishes they wanted from those, and then went to the cafeteria and went out to the main dining area to eat whatever they'd taken. So cost was not really an issue between dishes here. And importantly, for our study, what we thought was an important detail, this meant that people could leave the experimental station and go elsewhere and choose other dishes if they wanted, which will explain one of our findings that we see that I'll get into a little bit later. For our experimental station, which was only one of the many stations that were in the dining hall, each day of the study was randomly assigned to either be under a vegan default or a no default control condition. This is something that, again, we thought was an important detail because all previous studies had focused on an explicit vegetarian default versus an explicit meat default. And that omits situations where there isn't a default, like in dining halls when dishes are put side by side, there's no explicit default. That's a common occurrence. And as a result, from previous studies, we don't know if the effects that we're seeing is due to the use of a vegan default or vegetarian default in those cases, or the removal of an explicit meat default. So we focused on that comparison in this context. And so what happened was that on the control days, it would be kind of business as usual, as you would expect. People would go up to this dining hall station and people would see two dishes that were behind a sneeze guard that were relatively identical versions of the same dish, just that one was vegan and one was not. So in the example that we, I believe, used in the picture that you referenced, we have a beef bulgogi dish and a tofu bulgogi dish. Functionally very similar protein, similar spice and cooking techniques, similar vegetables, just the change of what the protein was. Under the vegan default, though, the non-defaulted, the meat dish, was taken out from behind the sneeze guard, hidden away from view. So when people came up to the station, they would see only the vegan dish. And there would be signage saying that this is the vegan dish, and then below that saying there's also a beef version of this or a meat version of this available upon request. So this is using a few techniques to signal what the default is. There's the visual aspect that people are just scanning the case, they'll only see the one dish. The signage lists the defaulted version first and says that people have to ask, and therefore it's also using effort to make people ask for this other option that they then have to go get from elsewhere, that the service staff has to go get from elsewhere. So it's using a lot of techniques. It's a little heavy-handed. There can be lighter or less extreme versions of this, but we were using this on randomized days so that it wasn't simply a control period compared to an experimental period, given that there can be learning effects or seasonal effects in dietary patterns. And what we found was that on the control days, we saw what you might expect. An overwhelming majority of students took the meat dish. The vegetarian dish wasn't, or the vegan dish wasn't not taken, but it was relatively the minority of cases. However, in the vegan default condition, we see a reversal of this. There was an increase in the number of plant-based dishes that were taken by roughly 50%, going up from about 73 per day in the control condition to about 116 in the experimental condition. And then there was a 50% drop in the meat dish consumption from about just under 200 to about 85. So these were pretty drastic shifts. And in fact, we see that the vegan dish was more popular than the meat dish under the plant-based default. This is undercut a little bit by the fact that there was an overall drop in servings given out between the plant-based default day and the control day. So we suspect that many people saw the experimental condition, or saw the station on the experimental days and chose to go somewhere else in the dining hall. But even if we assume that those same people went and got dishes elsewhere in the dining hall and got a meat dish elsewhere, we tried to account for that by looking at the raw number of sales difference between the 2 days. And even if we assumed all of those people got meat elsewhere, we still see a significant drop in meat consumption as a result of this intervention. There are, of course, caveats with that, as there are with any type of field study like this, but we feel pretty confident in saying that this was able to shift dining on a day-to-day level towards a more plant-based option, and pretty measurably so compared to many other types of effortful psychological interventions that we've done in other types of settings.
Yeah, so I think from what I gathered from the study, it was between about 20 and 50% reduction you think you got in meat intake from basically putting the meat dish not visible, but instead of showing it, you have a sign that says available on request. That's the
Mhm.
only change.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. No messaging that this is the right thing to do, or trying to convince people that one is healthier or tastier or anything. Just changing how the options are presented had one of, in my own line of research, the most sizable effects that I've seen.
And the whole like vegan and plant-based issue is just such a complicated minefield of ideology and drama in terms of the different ways that the vegan community can go about trying to persuade people. Sometimes it's very scientific and easy to understand and kind of logical, and other times it can be quite hysterical and really quite. I mean, I've seen a lot of vegan people online being really, I mean, I would even say the word like pretty confidently abusive, like abusive to even to each other, vegans versus vegans. It's kind of a
Mhm.
strange space. And so I think that is a sort of a negative. It puts veganism and vegetarianism, I think particularly veganism more than vegetarianism, a sort of a negative brand. It sort of has a negative brand in a way. Like maybe in terms of a health brand, it's good, but I think in terms of do I really want to call myself that or be near that when it can be such ideologically kind of prickly space. In terms of all of the different, you mentioned there's the default compared to all these other ways that you can perhaps persuade people. What do you think people are doing wrong that is not helping meat intake go down when they are trying to advocate for this message? That's kind of causing this negative stigma about vegan eating.
It's a big question. I think there are a lot of things that you can point to as being having limitations at the very least, because I think the question of what you're trying to do with any type of intervention is gonna be different from person to person. I think, as you mentioned, there's this perception of vegans being particularly militant or confrontational that I think is maybe not 100% unwarranted, but also is a factor that is in any type of group scenario. Often people look to the most extreme members of that group to get a characterization of the group. You can see this in things like the political right in America. If you don't regularly engage with people in that group, you might characterize them all as being similar to the most far right people that you see in news media. In the same way, if you don't regularly interact with vegans or vegetarians, you only characterize them with the characters or the most extreme characters that you see from those spaces in online settings. For example, I myself am vegan, and if I like to think that if I'm walking down the street on any given day, people aren't clocking and seeing like, oh, that's like one of those extreme militant vegans. But at the same time, if they, have a conversation with someone, they get to know them a little bit better, and that can be an important thing. I know there's past work that's shown one of the most influential things in terms of people reducing their meat consumption, becoming vegetarian, is simply just knowing other vegetarians, getting to have that type of exposure, having exposure to plant-based dining and seeing what that can really be like. I think there is, but at the same time, I think there is a place for some of that more confrontational arguments, especially if you're trying to convince someone to go from meat reduction or vegetarianism to veganism, to take that next step without being confrontational about things like animal rights and animal abuse. Someone who is vegetarian for the environment might never give up cheese or eggs, for example. It takes some of that confrontation. It's not going to work for everyone, but it can be an influential step in that process. But I don't think you should be doing that to random people on the street who aren't even open to that argument yet. As you said, there's a lot of identity processes here, and there's a great paper that came out several years ago about moral minority practice identities and how there are these things you have to overcome in movements like transportation and trying to move people towards cycling or getting people to adopt these dietary based identities where people might feel that they share similar values and beliefs but want to avoid the stigma of that identity. And that can hinder the movement in a way that being an ally for social justice movements doesn't have the same barrier. But there are other movements like Meatless Monday or things or reducitarians or flexitarians that are trying to at least get people to take those first steps that they might then be more amenable to other interventions in the future. These are at least some of the identity processes that are going on. I think there's also just showing people that vegan food and vegetarian food can be good and normal. There's a lot of discussion among people who are the most adamant meat defenders that things like even as common as tofu are unhealthy or weird or tasteless, and that most people don't want to eat those things. And just showing that these things can be tasty and good is a critical step because many people aren't going to care as much about the environmental side of things, but getting them to change their diet for other reasons, whether it's just even ease or cost, can be a good step.
Can you talk a bit about that moral minority identity? I just wrote it down. Maybe I'm not saying it back to you properly, what that was. Because, as a, I mean, I call myself an action designer and I teach other people like action designers, like how to get people to do stuff. Whenever I see that come up, I always see it as this big problematic hurdle I have to try to get
Mhm.
over and bring people into a space that's more measurement driven, less ideologically based, and get people to not perceive humans in this us and them way, but just to perceive us kind of all the same, like we're all friends. And now we just need to start adopting the thing. We just need to start doing it. It doesn't matter if someone's like wearing like a red MAGA hat. Like I'm like, they got to build a vegetable garden too, folks. Like let's, hang out and figure out how to get everybody to do the thing. Can you talk just a little bit more and just clarify sort of what that was? Because you just sort of spoke about it very quickly. And I
Yeah.
think it's like a new concept. I mean, I hadn't heard of it before, and I don't think the listeners have heard of it before either.
Yeah. So there was this article that was put forth in a special issue a few years ago by Tim Kurz and Anaya Prosser and some others about moral minority practice identities. So kind of breaking that down into like the individual things. It's an identity process and how identity can be this really influential thing in getting people to take action. There are many psychological models that look at both individual action and collective action to show that identification with environmentalists or identification with a collective movement can be really important for getting people to actually engage in behavior change. But the moralized minority aspect here is that there are some identities that are relatively uncommon. They are the minority in a population, and they're often based around some, in this case, moral minority practice identity, based around something people do. It's not just a belief, it's not just an identity label, it's something that you do. You walk the walk. You can kind of think about this in terms of when there was discussion. I mean, historically, there has been discussion about the role of allies in social movements and what it means to be an ally, and that you can't just call yourself an ally. You need to actually show up and do the work. In a more, maybe a more literal sense, you can't call yourself a vegan without actually being vegan and having that dietary change, having that lifestyle change. And the moralized aspect here is that the behavior itself is seen as moral, whether it's seen as moral by the people who are doing it or not, or they acknowledge that at least some people view it as moral, that's an important aspect here. So if you're a meat eater and you see a vegan who is speaking out about being vegan, whether or not you think eating meat or the abstination of meat is moral, you recognize that this person and many other people think this is a moral behavior. And indeed, there's a lot of research that shows that people have, I want to say at best, conflicting attitudes towards vegetarians and vegans, where it's not an outright negative view. They often do think of them as good people, think of them as moral individuals, but also maybe a little judgy and preachy. But that moral aspect is important. They think these are good people who are standing by their morals, who are acting in line with that. To then say, I agree with you, I support you, means you have to overcome the hurdle of Do you want to engage with that behavior yourself? If you do, you risk the association with that label. And for many people, they don't want to be associated with vegans and vegetarians. And that can be a hurdle that people have to overcome and that these movements have to overcome. You can't just get someone to sign a petition. You need to actually get people to take on this practice-based identity as an end goal for different aspects of it. And that can be a real challenge. And that's why I think some things like reducitarianism or flexitarianism can be helpful where people can change their dietary behaviors without taking on this identity. I don't think that should be the end goal personally, but I also recognize the value in that in actually getting people to take that first step to see what it's like and really at least have some impact in changing their diet.
So, is the kind of end place we get to with these moral minority practice identities, is that are they kind of a good thing or a bad thing? Or is it one of those things that's like a double edged sword? It can go kind of either way.
I think it can be. I'll say that the original paper that I was referencing here paints this as potentially a bad thing in this space. I mean, the article itself starts off with the title, Could Vegans and Lycra Cyclists Be Bad for the Planet? It's the idea that by having these practice-based identities that have these strong social stigmas, people really want to distance themselves from that, and that creates this hurdle that you don't have in other spaces. And you can see this in any number of domains as well, where these identity processes can harm getting people into that movement and helping them get that first step. That said, getting people to adopt these identities and stick with it, it's a very strong group and that you can immediately identify with other people and have support from the group. You can recognize that other people are against you, which can be difficult, but also it means that you kind of have to stick to your guns in certain places. I know for myself, and I can speak to my own personal journey, when I became vegan, that was a really important aspect because it meant that it was something that I was trying to live up to. It was a goal of mine, and that helped me engage in that behavior change in a way that just saying, like, I think this is broadly good to do didn't translate into behavior in the same way. So I think the idea of this line of work pitches that it can be a hurdle, but identity we know can be a motivating factor. So it's still good to try to cultivate that identity at some point, but maybe not as a first step and recognize that these intergroup dynamics can hinder action in many cases.
Yeah, yeah. I get very disturbed by some of these sort of moral practice identities that I see in the vegan space, mainly just around people being very unkind and aggressive to other people that are perhaps even all on the same side. Like I've had people just it's mainly just people writing on the internet. Sometimes it's interpersonally. People will
Mhm.
just be very interpersonally unkind about something to somebody else. And I don't think that ever works. I don't think anyone's ever had somebody be really rude to them. And it's like been like, you know what? I think I'm going to go vegan now. It just makes it says what you mentioned before is that one vegan's rude activity kind of pollutes then all vegans and vegetarians because we're sensitive to this negative feedback. And you're like, oh, I can't talk to these people anymore because I'm going to experience another one of these interactions.
I can see what you mean. I agree that there can be this ripple effect. I think it is also we have to, as people who are in this space, remind ourselves that when you have comments from one person, it's not reflective of the entire community, and that's an effort that we have to make as well. And I think it still can have some positive effect for some people of pointing out for many vegans where this is not just a sustainability issue, but an animal rights issue, pointing out, potential inconsistencies in others' behaviors and values can at least get people to start thinking. It's a question of if that's the end goal of that person and what the overall impact is. So I don't think that's the best way of going about it. But I think there's a lot of complexities of what any individual action or what people are saying can have. I think it'll have some impacts on some people, other impacts on others.
And what you mentioned also earlier was that the most the thing that influences people the most to change their diet patterns to become more plant-based is a social contact or a social bond
Mm,
between a meat-eating person and a non or less meat-eating person.
mhm.
Can you talk a bit more about that research and what that would look
Yeah.
like? Two people hanging out, just having lunch together, and one person orders one thing, one person orders another thing. Which is kind of, I asked this question specifically to segue from the where there are these sort of prickly vegan conversations. That if there's anything you want to do as a plant-based person, it's probably going out for lunch with meat-eating
Mhm.
people and creating more of that social diffusion.
Yeah, so if I use the terminology most, I don't know that I can. Yeah, I might have misspoken there. I don't know if I can stand by that to say it's the most influential thing, but and powerful factor can be having vegetarian friends and having that exposure to plant-based dining as a more normalized thing. I mean, we see this in some of Greg's work on dynamic norms. As you see that more and more people are doing something, it feels more regular. It feels like something that other people are doing and care about. So people may be more willing to engage with that themselves. Will a majority of people inherently see someone sitting next to them eating a salad or a plant-based burger and immediately say, you know what, I should do that too? Probably not, but it is a factor that can drive this types of action that can have these ripple effects of if someone sees me eating a plant-based burger and maybe only 1 out of 10 people who see me doing that say, "You know what? I'm gonna try that today as well." That's one more person who's doing that. Then people are suddenly seeing, okay, before it was 1 person, now it's 2 out of 11 and just continues to ripple, forward in that way. And having friends who share their types of dietary patterns with you, share their values, it kind of opens that door and makes it feel more personal rather than, whatever perceptions they had of vegan and vegetarian dining prior to that. So I think getting people to take that first step can signal to other people that this is normal, and it's just seeing that other people are doing this makes it feel more normal, more attainable, something that they can actually do.
Yeah, and I think these sort of small day-to-day habits that we do socially are often like sort of not considered to be that important. But one real a trend that comes through all of these interviews is just how powerful, or it seems to be that all of the people who study the social science of change seem to all come
Mhm.
to this one point, which is when you do something physically with another person witnessing you doing it, that these are absolutely essential moments of every social movement of change. So if you're just thinking about like, oh, it's just the impact of like one burrito, like what's one burrito going to have? It's really not that. It's like how many people observed you having that one burrito, and that this is essential for breaking up all of the old norms and sort of letting space for all the new norms, almost like sort of roots growing through society, through behaviors to grow. I know that wasn't a question. Maybe you can.
Yeah, no, yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, social movements are not simply. I want to stand behind people posting online as being an important part of any social movement, and the like hashtag activism gets a lot of slack. And I think the real answer is that it's not just that, and it is important for people to see things that are happening in the real world and see people saying things. This is the reason why things like bumper stickers have mattered for things for so long. Of this is the reason why politicians know to give people signs to put in their yards. It's a way of signaling what other people are doing or will do, what people care about and value. And this is especially key for things that are so polarized, that are imbued with so much meaning, and that people think are so abnormal. I remember the anecdote of someone asking kind of a pointed question of, "Oh, how are those vegan green beans?" And it's like, green beans. They're great by themselves, and pointing out and showing people what vegetarian and vegan dining can be, and pointing out in ways that they already are pretty aligned with it can be a really influential way of getting people to realize that they might actually be open to it or that they can actually try it. Many people are already aligned with many of the values that are true in veganism and vegetarianism, as well as just the environmental movement more broadly. Two kind of data points that come to mind are some of the more recent work that's come out about pluralistic ignorance in America and the world.
Oh, sorry,
Uh,
we just say that again. I didn't. The research
pluralis-
about,
Pluralistic ignorance.
yes. Okay, we've covered that a few times. Pluralistic
Yeah,
ignorance. Yeah.
yeah. The research on pluralistic ignorance in America and the world in regards to climate action, in that a majority of people in the world and in America across the political aisle support climate action, but they think that they are if not in the minority, that it is a smaller minority that actually supports it. And so that leads to people self-silencing and people not actually expressing their beliefs. Whereas if people actually just shared, like, I care about this in some way or another, it can actually support people, maybe not to change their beliefs because they're already aligned, but to actually engage in behavior that's consistent with that. In the same way with the vegan and vegetarian movement, there was a great book that came out a few years ago about the psychology of human animal relations and vegetarianism and veganism, about why we love and exploit animals. Because people really do like animals. People care about animal feelings. You can look online and there are any number of just scrolling through cute pictures of animals, even farm animals. People care about emotional well-being and the well-being of animals, but they just have come up people use internalized psychological tricks to reduce the dissonance of why we like them, but then also continue to eat these animals. So people are open to the arguments of vegetarianism and veganism in many cases. It's just getting that door open to make it feel normal and less stigmatized. And that can really get people to actually change their behavior, potentially more than just education.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important dynamic to expand upon, that we as environmentalists or activists, we don't want to just create in groups of our own kind. And it happens a lot and it can be very easy to do. You want to bring people together who are sort of the same as you. I have a friend who organizes a vegan meetup once a month. Obviously, only vegans come to the vegan meetup unless somebody is like sort of dragged along a friend or something. But there's no agenda or incentive for people who are not vegans to come. And I think his vegan meetup, it's really just a social thing. So I'm not really sure if he's trying to do it as a sort of a tool of activism. I don't think so. I think it is just like a social meetup to, friends to get together. But it is kind of like that would be something, perhaps if you were trying to advocate for change, you might come up with an idea like that. You're like, let's all hang out together. Let's have a vegan restaurant. Let's have a vegan picnic. Let's all get together, all the vegans. And if you have just vegans hanging out with other vegans or people that are in any type of environmental thing, no matter what it is, everybody hanging out with each other, that's not really a mechanism for creating those really important social diffusion events where somebody is doing something with a person who's sort of side by side with someone who's not doing it, and kind of allowing that sort of old norm to be broken up, getting people who are used to it. So I think if you are really looking to, I mean, it might be just super obvious for some people, but it's also not obvious for others, is to, rather than think, oh, let's get everybody together who's doing this one thing, it's like, well, maybe get everyone together, but the deal is you have to bring another person who's new to it. Like, let's all, like, you have to bring a
Mhm.
plus one of somebody who's totally new to it. And then, we'll have like 50% of people who are like the deep people into it and 50% of
Mhm.
people who are like sort of the newbies. And then that's where I think you'll really have like the magic happen.
I think there's absolutely space for both. I know I, for the last few years, have hosted a vegan Friendsgiving. And granted, my social group is probably more open to vegetarian and vegan dining than the typical American group because it's people that I feel a kinship and allyship with and choose to socialize with and invite to this. But most people who come to this are not vegetarian or vegan by default, but they recognize that this is a vegan event because I'm hosting it, inviting people in. They come and have a full feast that is vegan, and they get to see what that's like and get to experience that with others. And as a result, also do some vegan cooking themselves. So there are moments like that where you can kind of invite people in with that explicit purpose. Not everyone is going to be open to that, but that can be a way of getting people who are already open to the idea another step of the way. There's also still importance of having those vegan spaces for vegans as kind of a safe space to build resiliency among the group because vegans do face a lot of stigma and hardship in the way our current system is set up. Thinking about defaults that we've been talking about, there are rarely situations where the vegan option is the default. Even something as simple as going to get a coffee, you have to pay extra for vegan dairy milk, non-dairy milk. That's a way of making that non-default, and it takes extra effort, extra social pressure. So having that space to build resiliency and community is important, but that's not going to inherently get other people to change. So having other more public spaces can be an important thing, even if it's as simple as at a work outing, insisting that they provide a vegan option shows that there are vegans there, gets them to do that for the future, gets people there who are eating a vegan option, visibly seeing that it's there. So being bold and being open about it in spaces where it can have a visual impact and people can see and discuss about it, but also having spaces for just community and support. Both are important in a social movement.
Yeah, and that's a really important nuance that you've brought into separating it too, because I think people are trying to do perhaps the same thing at the same time. They're trying to sort of
Mhm,
like build their strengths and sort of capacity building and their inner circle. And then they're sort of trying to use that to also get out to people and perhaps a little bit muddled about like what it actually is, because often things start sort of more vague and less defined, usually in the beginning, and they become more strategic and defined over time. But if you can just ask yourself with your group, is this an inner circle group for us to get, create social
mhm,
connection and support and get better at what we're doing? Or is this a tool to bring in new people and introduce them? And just decide, which one it is, because it's going to take on a very different form depending on what you're trying to do with your group. And if you can just ask yourself, well, which group is it? Then you can, actually do a really good
mhm.
job of that rather than sort of just trying to do a bit of everything and not really know, whether it's working or where it's going.
Yeah, which type of group is it, or what type of event? Like, if you're a group that wants to do many different types of things, having like in-group social events versus outreach and support, trying to do skill building as an external outreach, you're not going to do those at the same time, but you can be the same group working on all of these different axes. So I think, yeah, having that thought process of what you're trying to do with each group can be important, and being strategic about it.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we got to say that, because in these conversations, like they kind of bring out these things. It can be kind of like a new concept. Like I've never thought of that
Mhm,
exactly before. Like I've sort of thought about it, but now that we're talking about it, I'm like, that's a really, really important distinction, like that I think
mhm.
like a lot of people don't make.
Yeah, this is I just to add to that, this is something, we've talked about this pretty exclusively in the dietary context, but you can see this in any number of other domains. Like, if you're someone who invested in having an electric car, driving that to events and showing what it's like can be a really important tool in getting people to shift towards that. Same with things like induction cooktops or any type of novel technology. That can be a great way of inviting people over and showing off that. Like, it can sometimes feel a little like braggy of like, "Look at this new cooktop I got," but at the same time, it's showing people what it's like and getting them some firsthand exposure. Having space to be bold and show off to other people can be a really influential thing, regardless of what that behavior or adoption of new technology might be.
Yeah, yeah, and have it kind of paired with like an inner support group of people that are your like
Mhm,
super deep green people that you can be sharing your problems and kind of like emotions and strategy with. Yeah, it would be a very different type of thing to like, yeah, like an induction stovetop cooking event. Maybe vegan as well. Layer them all on. Layer all the
mhm.
events with solar, with growing your own vegetables all together. Okay, so let's wrap up the conversation about the paper with your research. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about defaults or how this can be used for practical sustainability folks? Any last messages that you think like is important for people, climate managers, sustainability managers, people working at cities, people running NGOs, everyone who's trying to do this stuff on the ground?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is defaults are just an important tool, and think about how you can implement them and how you might already be unconsciously implementing them. Almost any type of decision making framework that already exists uses defaulting techniques in some way already, whether consciously or not. And so using vegan defaults, for example, or any type of green default can be a powerful tool, but also just removing explicit, like non sustainable status quo defaults can be an important aspect of that as well. So looking through what practices you currently have in terms of questions and how you're giving options to people. I think it's important to think about the many different methods for by which you can use defaults, how you can signal those defaults, whether that be personal testimony, amount of space, things like we've discussed like there. Even the distance between options can be important. If you spend a lot of time talking about one option and then at the very end talk about another one, people are more often going to go for that first one. So think about how you're using defaults already and how you want to use them. Because the strongest defaults have effects. Like we talked about, it reduced sales at that one station in our experiment. People went to other stations in the dining hall. Luckily, this was all you care to eat. So, the university's bottom line didn't get affected by this. They still got the meal swipes that they wanted from that. So it is something to consider of maybe you want to use a lighter default, but you can still use them. And how you have your menu already situated if you're in a dining setting. If you have your vegetarian options secluded into their own section, you're already using a default in that you're making them the non-default options. So maybe scatter them throughout the rest of the menu in some way. Looking critically at your practice and thinking, how can we change this, can be a good first step where you don't need to do much. These are easy to implement interventions because you're changing the decision-making context, which will have these pretty direct impacts.
I'm so glad that we've talked about this leading into the choice architecture module that we're going to be doing next week, because I was not going to include defaults in that. I was just really thinking about it in the context of like, don't give people too many choices at once. So now I am going to add kind of a summary of what we've talked about. So thank you for helping us expand the detail in the curriculum. It's a wonderful thing about these conversations is it just emerges. Like read the paper and you sort of get ideas from it. Then read the paper and have the conversation with you or other authors. And then it just kind of like unveils like all of these ideas and things to do and like stuff that can be designed like in the real world. And it really is my passion and excitement to sort of bring this knowledge out and just see like what we can come up with in the real world that we can actually, just design and sort of implement in regular day-to-day life. So thank you for helping us on this journey of figuring this out. And what's the next step? What are you hoping to research in the next 5 years, or what would you love to uncover or discover?
So many things. In this area of work, I'll say we've done a little bit where we're looking at how you can change the way things are defaulted and changing certain factors and how that can make them more or less impactful. I'm particularly also interested in, I think I mentioned, how you can pair these types of subtle structural interventions with more explicit psychological interventions. Like if you use a default paired with a norm message, is that more impactful than just using a default? And importantly, do these types of effects spill over into other types of behaviors? Yes, we're able to change people's dining behavior in the dining hall, but then if we track them for the rest of the year after that, are they actually going to change their dining outside of the dining hall in other contexts? It's important to see what the spillover of these types of effects might be. We also have a lot of other stuff going on about just beliefs about climate change as a whole and collective action, policy support. But in this area, I think those are some of the key next steps that we're really excited to keep working towards.
Yeah, exciting. And it's always wonderful to hear that the social psychologists, environmental psychologists like yourself, you're always studying this nexus between individual change and systems change. That it's never this binary, as often I feel like say a lot of people who are perhaps outside of this field see it as this binary one or the other. It seems to be that the perhaps a meta lens of this field is this interconnection between the two. Would you say that?
I'd say that it's growing in that direction. I would say, even 5 or 10 years ago, it was only a minority movement of saying we need to look at systems change as well. And there's still some outspoken voices that say we only need to look at systems change. But I'd say the majority of people in this space now, and I also from some of our other work that's coming out soon, majority of Americans really think we need both policy, systemic change, as well as individual change to solve our social issues like climate change. So I'm glad to see that the field is moving in that direction and that we're trying to push for that type of change on all levels and utilizing the idea of, well, we need many types of interventions working in tandem at once to address the many aspects of this issue. The idea of silver buckshot rather than a silver bullet.
A silver what?
Yeah, it's something that I picked up from Greg a while ago, silver buckshot rather than a silver bullet.
Buckshot.
Buckshot is from, a shotgun that shoots a bunch of pellets rather than a singular bullet. And the idea that when you're trying to solve an issue like climate change, you're not going to have one key solution. You're going to have many solutions working on all axes trying to solve this together. And so I see this as both, even if you're looking only at individual change, the number of psychological interventions that you could use together all can work together and need to work together or need to work simultaneously. But especially when you're looking at complex systems, you're not going to find one solution that addresses everything. Keep working on all angles. And I think we're really interested in how can we motivate people to continue to work at both individual and systemic change.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of your enormous knowledge and insight. And thank you for being on the How to Save the World podcast, Joel.
Thank you for having me.